Hi, I'm John Hildebrand,
And I'm Chris Colotti.
and we're here to discuss a lot of the Cohesity integration with VMware Cloud Director. So Chris, I can't help but notice there's quite a few things here on the board. You're going to walk us through a little bit about how they're all integrated together to make this a single workflow?
Yeah. So, John, it's a good point. I think what people need to understand, and most people who are familiar with Cloud Director already know that VCD pretty much talks to Virtual Center, and then Virtual Center talks to the ESX host. So we're not going to cover that. I think what's important is to understand where Cohesity fits into this whole picture, because there is a lot of moving parts. So at the core, what we actually have to do is make sure that Cohesity can not only talk to ESX, because that's where we stream the data, but we also have to talk to Virtual Center, and at the same time, we also talk to VCD. So you might wonder, well, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, when we go and register this source, are we looking at registering each individual source, or are we looking at being able to hit one of these to get everything?
It's a great point, John. So most people who are familiar with Cohesity with Vcenter, they know they register the Vcenter source, right? And from that, we know about the ESX host and the virtual machines. Well, the VCD source is the missing key here. What's interesting is we never register the host in this scenario. All we do is we register VMware Cloud Director, and as part of that registration screen, it actually asks us for the credentials to the virtual centers that are known by that VCD cell. So it's a little bit combined, in which case, if you're not connecting directly to Virtual Center, the only source you'll see is VCD, but in the background, we've registered the Virtual Center credentials.
I can't help but notice we also have some tenanting going on here. You want to go through a little bit of exactly how some of the tenanting is mapped up in here so that we can ensure that customer A is getting to customer A's VCD information?
Yeah. So everyone knows VCD runs on multi-tenancy. That's the whole point of the product, right? Well, in Cohesity, we actually have an option that's called organizations. And when you enable organizations, you're able to create tenants. Now, they're out of the gate, they're not mapped to Cloud Director. In a sense, you would have, say, tenant A in VCD, and in Cohesity, you'd create an org called tenant A. Now, from there, once we make the registration connection, we can go into the organization's configuration and say tenant A on our side uses this virtual data center associated with tenant A on the VCD side. Also, we can separate the storage domains and other pieces and parts to ensure true multi-tenancy. So we do have that mapping here between us and VMware Cloud Director.
Well, good. So ensuring that there is good, proper separation between here is also going to ensure that our service providers and other entities that are dividing up these resources are going to ensure that there's very secure walls between their data and what they're backing up and what they're actually running as far as their solution is.
And once it's done, we also do provide the tenants access, limited access into the Cohesity platform for them as a tenant to do backup operations, create jobs, and then also the provider can lay on top of that other operations as well.
Okay.
John, I've taken everybody through how the components interact. Why don't you take everybody through what a backup job looks like in this scenario?
Sure, Chris. So obviously we're going to start off first at the Cohesity layer. This is where all the backup information is going to exist. So the job, the policy, how frequent we're going to perform the backup. So the first thing that we're going to do from the Cohesity side is we're going to ask VCD for its metadata information. Now, the metadata information is important and is going to come into play heavily when we want to do a restore of this particular object.
So what kind of metadata are we talking about? VCD's got a lot of objects. Most people who use it know you've got VApps, VMs, NORG networks, external networks, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's exactly the information that we're gathering here, because at the end of the day, when we do the restoration, we want to ensure that VCD has the right spots that it's going to be putting those particular objects back into. It's not just about making sure that Vcenter has the object, which is now what we're going to get to after we've asked vCloud Director. Now, if we remember from when you were discussing earlier, when we registered VCD, we also registered a Vcenter that's associated with that instance. So we then take from the Cohesity side of the equation and we ask for Vcenter information for that particular VM. Now, that in turn is going to give us access and let us know about all the associated ESX hosts that are going to be with that particular vCenter. So I'm not going to perform a drawing over there. That's just going to be assumed as part of the natural progression of talking with a vCenter. Now, the last stage, though, does involve the ESX host because it does involve us streaming the data over to the Cohesity device. Now, this is where the actual backup of the data from vCenter occurs. So we get the VM. Now, our last stage is we're going to associate VCD, that metadata, we're going to put that as part of that same backup set so that when we can perform the restoration, we now have all the parts available for us to bring that back to where it was located at originally.
So is it safe to say from this portion that you talked about, this is really the traditional Cohesity backup under the covers with the exception of getting metadata from VCD?
Yeah, I would say that that would be the case because VCD just brings its own objects that we have to make aware because there is that relationship between VCD and vCenter we do have to worry about. But under the hood, we're looking at the fact that it really is just a VM object that we're backing up. So it's a traditional vCenter-based backup at that point. Now, Chris, we just showed the backup of these particular devices within VCD. What's the restore process look like?
So John, that actually looks a little bit different because folks that are familiar with our vCenter restoration know how that works, and that's actually how it starts out. So the very first process when we do a restore, or a tenant more appropriately does a restore, is Cohesity appliance is going to talk to Virtual Center, right? And the reason for that is it's going to do what we always do. We're going to ask Virtual Center to present a volume off of our file system to the ESX host for us to restore the virtual machine. So we tell Virtual Center, mount a volume on the ESX host. We present the virtual machine, we register it in vCenter like we normally would. We power it on and we start a storage vMotion of it, same as any other part of the restoration process. Mm-hmm. However, what's different there is we're not complete because we haven't yet told VCD about that object being restored. We're just restoring the VM. Mm-hmm. So there's what's known as an import command into VCD, where you can import VMs from vCenter into Cloud Director. Well, we actually issue that API call, and what that does is that kicks off a whole series of back and forth between VCD and vCenter, where we represent that back in as an object. And what happens is if you're watching Virtual Center in the logs, you'll see a bunch of changes happening to the VM. You'll see that we brought it in, we changed the network settings, a whole bunch of different operations occur against that VM, but that's taking all the metadata that you talked about and reapplying it so that this VM now goes back into the right org network, the right app within vCenter. So there's a lot of complexity there that happens, but I mean, moving the data is the easy part. We're really doing our standard process and remapping all of that information back and forth between these two objects with that API call.
Yeah, so from that perspective, with ensuring that metadata is backed up along with a standard vCenter based backup, the restoration really involves just one extra call.
Essentially, I mean, if you want to break it down that way. And the other interesting thing is we can do some interesting object changes, meaning let's say this tenant backed up a vApp, the entire vApp, or a single VM, which is a group of vApps, which we see in vCenter as VMs. But let's say they want to restore it, but restore it to a new vApp, or they want to restore it to a new virtual data center that the provider's given to them, like a testing data center. Mm-hmm. All of that object data can be restored, and options can be used to say, put it in a new virtual data center, take this VM and put it back in its original vApp, take this vApp and restore it as a new vApp. I mean, there's all kinds of options that can happen, and you can reattach to different networks and all that stuff. So the metadata could be reused to restore it back in place, but I think the key here is all of the test dev functionality, those other options that the tenant can have, also apply if there's other virtual data centers available to them or other vApps that they want to restore those objects to. So John, I think you'll probably notice throughout the conversation here, I've actually talked a lot about how the tenant can do multiple things. And why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, as you have alluded to, there are self-service capabilities. Now, it all starts with an HTML5 client that exists out on VCD. So this is a plugin that is installed on VCD that allows for not only the provider to interface with, so they can perform certain options like mapping the tenants the tenant profiles between the Cohesity side and VCD, but it also gives the customer the view into, or I should say the tenant, the view into their environment, so what they have access to, and to be able to perform these operations, set up jobs, look at the different policies that have been presented to them by the provider in this particular case. So the H5 client exists out here on VCD and allows the customer essentially to manage their own environment as if they had direct access to Cohesity and their organization on it.
And I think what I think is cool about this plugin is they can jump off directly to the Cohesity appliance if they wanted to, so they can manage it here or through the H5 client. There's what we call a built-in link between the two. But to your point, I think the biggest key to this is the self-service allows the tenants to take the load off of the service provider. So even doing a simple restore of a single VM for test purposes, they don't have to call a help desk for that. I think there's a huge advantage to the service providers for that. They don't have to take those simple calls, right?
Yeah, and in this particular case, if the provider can basically take a step back, it makes it easy for them to be able to provide what they're meant to do, which is the SLAs to the customer in the first place, or I should say the tenant in the first place. So in that perspective, this allows the tenant to be able to dictate and control how Cohesity is actually performing these particular tasks on behalf of their environment, instead of having to depend upon a provider to have to do every single uplift of a process on their behalf.
So if you'd like to learn more about the Cohesity and VMware Cloud Director solution, check out the links below in the description. You'll find two different videos. One will cover a lot of the provider side integration, and the other will cover a lot of the tenant side integration. So depending on which side of the fence you're coming from, you might want to watch one, you might want to watch both.